The physical characteristics and chemical processes of just a cell are remarkably intricate. When you combine cells to make the various tissues, organs, and systems that comprise a living being, things get more complex still. Medical researchers have the daunting task of trying to target the threads of only a few specific processes, or just one specific process, in this rich biological tapestry. In the last video, we talked about the activated form of Gilead's drug Remdesivir, and how it targets viral RNA-dependent RNA polymerase, or RDRP, and ultimately prevents viral RNA from being produced. In this video, we'll discuss some of the challenges to getting a drug like Remdesivir to its target in the first place, as well as a strategy called the prodrug strategy that is often used to overcome such obstacles. Here's a number of drugs currently on the market, the diseases they treat, and their mechanistic target. All of these drugs have one bizarre thing in common. None of these molecules are very active against their mechanistic target, if they're active against it at all. Which sounds wrong considering that these are all pretty effective drugs that are used or even overused. But these molecules all pull off a trick. Each of these molecules is converted into a different active form inside a patient. In the last video, we talked about the drug Remdesivir and how, once activated, it interferes with the production of viral RNA. And we also asked a question: why is it that we don't just take the active form of Remdesivir and be done with it? We know it's an active compound, right? Well, it turns out things aren't that simple. When most people think about a drug, they'll probably mostly just think about how a drug would affect a patient or a bacteria or whatever. In the case of Remdesivir, for instance, we know that it messes with viral RDRPs. We call this the pharmacodynamics of a drug, but that's really only one half of the picture. Patients, bacteria, and whatevers tend to be chemically complex entities. Any molecule put into this environment will inevitably interact with it, be that through some specific distribution pattern or by undergoing some chemical change. We call these effects of the organism on the molecule the pharmacokinetics of a drug. So back to our question. Why don't we just take the active form of Remdesivir? Why do we take this molecule instead? Well, there's a few reasons, actually. Like we've been talking about, this molecule targets viral RDRPs, and remember, that enzyme is in cells that have been infected with a virus. But when you take Remdesivir, it doesn't teleport to the inside of the infected cells ready to go against its target. It needs to get there first, and that road isn't easy. Let's think about the various barriers that the active form of Remdesivir would face if you tried to take it orally in, say, a pill. The first thing that needs to happen is that the drug needs to get liberated from the pill. That pill is a solid, and in order for our drug to start to get to, let alone inside, the infected cell, that pill has to dissolve. The active metabolite of Remdesivir is pretty water-soluble, so this is probably not a huge concern. But there's an additional layer of complexity. That pill isn't going to be solid activated Remdesivir. If it was, it probably couldn't hold its shape all too well and would just fall apart before the patient could even take it. To fix this, it probably also has some binder, like cornstarch or sugar. So the drug also needs to get free from these inert materials as well. Once dissolved and free from the inert materials, our drug is still in the digestive tract, probably in the stomach, where it will pass into the small intestine. The next step on the road to our target is getting absorbed into the bloodstream. Typically, for an orally available drug, this involves crossing through the wall of the small intestine. And once inside the bloodstream, after getting to the infected cell, it needs to get inside. Both of these events involve crossing a cell membrane, and, well, that's not going to be easy. So this is a vial of olive oil, and this is some table salt. Table salt is made out of a bunch of positively and negatively charged particles. These charges make it fairly easy for table salt to dissolve in water, but completely prevent it from dissolving in oil. The Remdesivir active metabolite in blood or in the small intestine would be very highly charged, with 3 or 4 negative charges near the triphosphate, and a positive charge at the nucleoside ring. Sure, that makes it pretty soluble in water, and that solubility did help us out earlier to liberate the drug from the pill, but as you can imagine, it makes it almost completely insoluble in environments like olive oil. This is actually a problem. Remember, in order to get from the small intestine to the bloodstream, and in order to get from the bloodstream to the cell, our drug is going to need to cross cell membranes. The inside of these membranes is chemically very similar to olive oil, and there's no way that remdesivir is going to want to be in it, and it needs to be in it to get through it. Although these membranes are very thin, they're very potent barriers for our drug. But let's ignore that for a second, because we've kind of skipped over an important point. We just assumed that a drug would get to its target if it got into the bloodstream, and frankly, that's not necessarily true. We're trying to get to the lungs, so we're probably fine. The lungs get high blood flow. But what happens if our drug just accumulates in the liver, or in fat tissue, or in the bone? Any drug that doesn't ever make it to its target is essentially wasted, or worse, can cause potentially serious side effects without even giving any benefits. So we need to make sure that the distribution of our drug in our patient puts enough of the drug where we want it and at the rate that we want it to get there without getting a bunch of our drug stuck where we don't want it to be. And we still haven't talked about one of the biggest problems with this compound. It's actually one we talked about last week, and it's fundamental to how Remdesivir works. Living organisms are remarkably chemically complicated. The term metabolism refers to the set of chemical reactions that occur in a living being, and there's a very real risk that along this journey, our drug will be metabolized. After passing through the mouth, which is chemically active but our drug probably won't be there for too long, the drug will hit the very acidic and very corrosive stomach, so we need to make sure that the drug doesn't just get digested. Then it hits the small intestine, which has a basic pH and an entirely different set of digestive enzymes. If we do get our drug into the blood, there's any number of enzymes there. And before our drug gets to an infected cell, it might spend some time in any number of organs, including the liver, which is designed to break down molecules in the body. Of course, this normally keeps you safe from toxins, which is a good thing, but it can be very frustrating when your drug just gets destroyed before it can even do anything. And it's pretty much guaranteed that activated remdesivir would get broken apart fairly easily, possibly before it got to a cell membrane that it needs to pass but can't anyway. Simply put, as a drug in a real patient, this molecule is awful. After our drug does what it needs to do, and once it's no longer needed or wanted, we do need to break it down, or at least somehow stop it from being active. When a molecule breaks down though, it doesn't just disappear, it becomes a number of new molecules. And you need to account for any possible effects and factors such as the toxicity and distribution and, yes, the metabolism of all of those degradation products, and those degradation products. Therefore, it is crucially important that our molecule degrades in a predictable or at least benign way. And finally, well, what goes in must come out somehow, so we need to make sure that the drug or its degraded products gets excreted. These factors, liberation, absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion, often abbreviated LADME or LADMET, are not yes or no things. They're best described with questions like what rate and where, and especially as the interplay between these factors. Since toxicity is so intricately involved with LADMET properties, it's often added to the acronym to make LADMA-T or LADMET. These factors are just a reality of drug design projects and are a large part of what makes them so challenging. Not only do you need to have a drug that can affect your desired target the way you want to without causing too much collateral damage, but you also need the drug to have good pharmacodynamic properties. And it's difficult, when it's even possible, to engineer any single molecule to have both good pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic properties for a given target. Well, any single molecule, that is. Let's look back at the molecules I listed in the beginning. If you try to take the active form of any of these molecules, they would fail some LADMET consideration. But what if you didn't take that molecule? Like we talked about, the chemical environment of a living organism is complex, but that doesn't mean that it's unpredictable. What if we administer one molecule with excellent LADMET properties that is engineered to change in a predictable way to a new molecule that has ideal on-target activity? Well, that's exactly how these molecules work. This strategy is called the prodrug strategy. Using the strategy can allow a drug to get around problems inherent to the active molecule without needing to compromise its activity. After all, quite often a part of a molecule that makes it more active on its target also makes it less able to say, cross a cell membrane. Granted, you still do need to think about the lab-met properties of your active compound. For instance, it still needs to get metabolized and excreted when you're done with it. But using this strategy, you can sidestep places where your active compound would almost certainly fail. With this strategy in mind, let's take another look at remdesivir and figure out how it's been designed to get around the obstacles we identified earlier. To do so, we'll work backwards from our active form. First off, we're going to cheat a bit. Remdesivir is injected intravenously, so we've skipped over all the issues we foresaw in the stomach and the small intestine, including trying to get from the small intestine to the bloodstream. I mean, nobody likes shots, but sometimes they're necessary. We still do have to deal with the instability of the triphosphate group, though. And this one is actually pretty easy to deal with. Remember, remdesivir is supposed to look like ATP, and ATP, adenosine triphosphate, can be made in cells from adenosine by sequential addition of phosphates. It's imaginable that if our drug gets into a cell without all the phosphates it needs to be active in place, then the cell might add the missing phosphates for us. And luckily, this turns out to be the case. The question then becomes, how many phosphates do we leave on? Well, 3 phosphates is unstable. Sure, if the phosphates broke off, they could get added later, but it's no huge advantage to having them there. And honestly, it costs additional money and time per phosphate when you go to manufacture the drug. And keep in mind, money and time are limiting factors to how much of a drug you can produce, which in turn affects how many patients you can treat, so let's not do that. We could go with 2 phosphates, but that still has this weak bond that we've identified earlier, so that's also out. What we're left with is either using 1 phosphate or using no phosphates, and the decision there is actually somewhat controversial. I've drawn this molecule with 2 hydrogens here and no net electric charge. However, this is not the form that the molecule would take if it was actually in the blood or in the cell or in the small intestine. In those environments, it would look more like one of these 2 molecules with 1 or 2 negative charges at the phosphorus, likely some mixture of both of these. There would also be some charge on the nucleoside ring. Remember, our drug is going to need to cross cell membranes, and all those charges make this molecule kinda like table salt. We bypassed this membrane permeability problem in the small intestine by just injecting our drug straight into the bloodstream, but we still need to get across the membrane of our target cell once we get there. And yeah, just like with the triphosphate, it's going to be hard to get our highly charged monophosphate into that very oily membrane interior, and if it can't get into the membrane, it can't get through it on its own. This makes that membrane a pretty potent barrier to the drug getting into the cell, and as you can imagine, the uptake of this molecule into the cell would be relatively slow. And if the drug isn't in the cell, it doesn't do anything for us, it's kind of useless. Now, if you have no phosphates, if you just have the nucleotide, you get a molecule that is decently water-soluble, and which actually can cross cell membranes fairly well. It's also a lot cheaper to make. This remdesivir nucleotide is actually an intermediate synthetically to make remdesivir itself. We actually add the phosphate to this molecule. And to top this all off, there's precedent for this. A number of nucleotide analog drugs are actually just taken as a nucleotide itself as your prodrug. So why does remdesivir still have its phosphate? What factor made the scientists at Gilead want to leave that phosphate on? Well, it turns out that a cell can add all 3 phosphates to a nucleotide, but adding the first phosphate is really slow compared to the second and the third. That means that if we don't have 1 phosphate on a molecule, it won't activate very quickly, resulting in lower active drug concentrations. So we've solved our problems with stability reasonably well, but we're still left with an unresolved issue of membrane permeability. So the question then becomes, well, how do we address that? Yep, we're going to take our prodrug and we're going to make a prodrug out of it. Phosphorus-based prodrugs are an active area of research, and the one we're going to be using here is something called a protide. Remdesivir is reasonably soluble in water while still being greasy enough to get through a cell membrane. Once inside, an enzyme cuts this part of the molecule off. This sets off a series of chemical reactions that gives us this intermediate, and then a final enzyme finishes off the cleavage process to yield our monophosphate. This monophosphate now is highly charged, and that's actually a good thing. Remember, the fundamental problem with the charged molecule technically wasn't that it couldn't get into the cell, that was a consequence, but rather it was that it couldn't get through cell membranes, which in turn kept it from getting into the cell. But that's actually a good thing now. It's inside the cell, so what we're doing now is we're keeping the drug in. After this, the cell adds the additional 2 phosphates we need to get our active metabolite. Since this molecule already has 1 phosphate on it, this process is fairly quick. Or at least, it's quicker than it would be if it was a nucleotide that didn't have any phosphates. What's particularly nice about this specific strategy are the byproducts. One of them is alanine, an amino acid. This molecule is a building block of proteins, and it already exists in large quantities in all cells and in all organisms. So from a safety perspective, it's a total non-issue, and we can more or less just forget about it. The second one is a phenol called phenol. This molecule is used as a drug already, and so its pharmacological profile is well known, and at the fairly low doses we expect to encounter it in this prodrug strategy, it isn't really an issue. The final molecule is an alcohol, 2-ethylbutan-1-ol, and that kind of sounds scary, but this molecule is found in a number of plant-based food products, including tequila, and all the other foods listed on the screen, and many, many more. So it's really not that concerning at all. These 3 parts, an amino acid, a phenol, and an alcohol, are what make this a protide strategy. This protide strategy isn't really unique to remdesivir. There's actually a number of protide drugs in the various stages of development, including a number of nucleotides, but also including other molecules such as immunotherapy compounds. This reuse and optimization of a working strategy really isn't surprising. Looking back at the list of prodrugs from the beginning, what you can see is that a number of these share the same prodrug strategies. In addition, newer prodrug strategies often involve combinations of older ones. Many scientists actually research new prodrug technologies on already existing drugs instead of just researching new modes of drug action. And I think the benefits of this kind of research are obvious. Having done my PhD in organophosphorus synthetic medicinal chemistry, one area near and dear to my heart is the area of phosphorus prodrug research, a field I believe will see significant advances in the next decade. Given all this, it might surprise you that prodrugs are, or at least were, fairly controversial, with a number of scientists thinking of them as bad drug design. This is something of a historical artifact. In the past, a prodrug strategy was, by and large, a way of salvaging a non-working or just generally problematic drug in an ad hoc manner. Since the non-working drug could be viewed as a result of poor drug design, prodrugs probably got some negativity unfairly associated with them. More fair criticisms of them are that although they do help overcome certain challenges in lab-met concerns, they can actually make others more complicated. Metabolism especially becomes a significant concern for a prodrug. Not only do you need to make sure that the prodrug is activated where and when and at the rate that you want it to be, but you also need to make sure that all the degradation products are well accounted for. And some prodrugs do actually release toxic molecules on activation, though in some cases researchers tend to be overly critical of these issues. Regardless, their more complex metabolic landscape makes prodrugs notoriously harder to model than non-prodrug therapies. In the United States, there's also regulatory complexity surrounding prodrugs. I'm not going to get into this in detail, maybe someday with a patent lawyer who actually knows what they're talking about, but there's 2 sides as to whether or not you should grant a prodrug IP protection. On the one hand, the same arguments for such protections on all drugs do apply to prodrugs. Fundamentally, we want to encourage their development. On the other hand, patent trolling and patent abuse are very, very real things and very, very real problems. It's conceivable that someone could, in bad faith, just steal someone else's drug, slap a prodrug on it, and patent that as a new molecule without really doing any creative work or contributing to the field in any meaningful way. This was such a big problem that as recently as 2011, the FDA and USPTO were taking what some notable prodrug chemists viewed as an aggressively anti-prodrug stance. Now, though, prodrugs are ubiquitous. What changed? Well, fundamentally, it came down to the attitude of how we think about prodrugs. Where in the past, prodrug strategies were considered to be a bit more of an ad hoc solution, they're increasingly becoming viewed as something integrated into drug design from the beginning of a project. This shift in thinking is accompanied with a shift in thinking about what molecular structures can be used in medicinal chemistry projects. Structural features which in the past would not have been considered for use in medicine due to the poor lab-met properties that they impart on a molecule, increasingly are being explored for their potential medicinal properties. And this is exactly the kind of thinking that was applied to remdesivir. This molecule wasn't salvaged from some poor activity with a prodrug strategy. Rather, the prodrug strategies it employs were almost definitely conceived early on in its design and to great effect. Other concerns are being addressed as well. For instance, the toxicity of prodrug degradation products isn't a problem with the strategy itself, it's really more a characteristic of poorly designed prodrugs. Modern prodrug strategies, like the protide strategy used in remdesivir, tend to address these issues just fine. In addition, recent advances in modeling how a drug moves through an organism have enabled better and better predictions of how prodrugs will behave in a patient, though these models still have their limitations, and improving them even further is an active area of research. Increasingly, though, scientists are starting to think of prodrugs not only as a means of enabling the use of structures that impart less than optimal ADMET properties. Instead, scientists are starting to view prodrugs as enabling entirely new and altogether different ways of thinking about pharmacokinetics that are fundamentally impossible with traditional drugs. Targeted delivery is an especially promising area of research. Drugs that only get activated in the specific tissues or cells where we want them to be active have the potential to mitigate side effects tremendously by preventing activity where we don't want it. There's some particularly brilliant ideas in this area. One involves tying an enzyme that can activate a prodrug to an antibody that binds a target cell. The antibody is administered first and finds the cellular targets. Afterwards, when the drug is administered, it only gets activated when it goes near those cells. Another strategy involves putting genes that code for specific activating enzymes into a virus, with selected delivery properties. This genetically modifies your target cells, such as the tumors, so that they, and only they, can activate your drug. The drug just doesn't do anything anywhere else. Another fascinating idea is the design of prodrugs that are activated by specific frequencies of light. This technology would allow a doctor to use a low-powered laser to activate a prodrug specifically in, say, a tumor. And this is only a small sample of the creativity that scientists are exhibiting in modern applications of prodrugs and related strategies. So that's how remdesivir works. And I actually mean it this time. This is how this drug works. It's a prodrug of an active metabolite that shuts down viral RNA production, stopping viruses from replicating effectively inside a target cell. And this prodrug strategy is what lets remdesivir get to its target in the first place, since the active metabolite would have pretty much no chance of working on its own. This prodrug strategy has been somewhat controversial in the past, but scientists increasingly are in favor of it, and some absolutely brilliant research efforts are underway to expand on the possibilities that this strategy enables. For now though, thanks for watching. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions, or if you've seen any other cool applications of prodrug design or similar strategies, and I'll see you next time.